Elsa, welcome. It's Fairy Tale Take Corners. And Meredith, Snattailed is a Cinderella.
Oh, hello there. My name is Allison, and I'm going to tell you my very favorite story. It's the tale of the little glass slipper. Are you ready? The little glass slipper. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who married for his second wife the proudest and most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had by a former husband 2 daughters of her own humor, and they were indeed exactly like her in all things. He had likewise by another wife a young daughter, but of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in all the world. No sooner were the ceremonies of the wedding over, but the stepmother began to show herself in her true colors. She was not very nice. She could not bear the good qualities of this pretty girl, because they made her own daughters appear that much more unpleasant. So she employed her in the meanest of household chores, and lay her up in a sorry garret up in the attic, and made her lay upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in fine rooms upon beds of the very newest fashion, and they were very comfortable, and where they had looking glasses, those are mirrors, so large that they could see themselves from head to foot. The poor girl was always very patient and dared not tell her father, for his wife governed him entirely. That means she was very strict with him. And when she had done her work, she would go into the chimney corner and sit down among the cinders and ashes, which made her commonly be called Cinder Breech. But the youngest sister, who was not so rude and uncivil as the eldest, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, notwithstanding her mean apparel, was 100 times handsomer than either of her stepsisters, though they were always dressed very richly. It happened that the king's son, the prince, gave a ball, that is a very fancy party, and invited all persons of fashion to it. Our young misses were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among the quality. They were mightily delighted at this invitation and wonderfully busy in choosing the gowns that they called upon Cinderella to be consulted in all these matters, for she had excellent notions and advised them always for the best. Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their heads awry. That means wrong or crooked. But she was very good and dressed them perfectly well. At last her stepsisters were off to the ball. And when Cinderella had lost sight of them, she fell crying. Her godmother, who saw her in her tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish. She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. This godmother of hers, who was a fairy, said to her, "You wish you could go to the ball, is it not so?" "Yes," cried Cinderella with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be but a good girl, run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin, like this one." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could get and brought it to her godmother. Not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball, her godmother scooped out the inside of it, leaving nothing but the rind, which done, she struck it with her wand. And the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. She then went to look into her mousetrap, where she found 6 mice, all alive. And with a little tap of her wand, the mice were at that moment turned into a very fine set of 6 horses. Being at a loss for a coachman, Cinderella found a rat, which her godmother turned into a fat, jolly coachman, and after that, 6 lizards into 6 footmen, all with only a tap of her wand. And finally, the fairy then touched her wand to the head of Cinderella. At the same instant, her clothes were turned into a cloth of beautiful silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers. Oh, the most beautiful in all the world. Being thus decked out, she got up onto her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay past the stroke of midnight, telling her at the same time that if she stayed at the ball 1 moment longer, her coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes would become just as they were before. She promised her godmother that she would not fail of leaving the ball before midnight, and then away she drove. The king's son, who was told that a great princess, whom nobody knew, was coming, and he ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand and led her into the ball. There was an immediate profound silence as they left off dancing. The violin ceased to play, so attentive was everyone on this unknown person's arrival. Nothing was then heard but a confused noise of, "How handsome is she?" The king's son conducted her to the most honorable seat, and afterwards took her out to dance with him. She danced so gracefully that they admired her even more. Even her stepsisters, for they knew not who she was. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and amorous speeches, that she quite forgot what her godmother had recommended to her, until she heard the clock strike midnight. She then rose up and fled away as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but he could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home, but quite out of breath, without coach or footman, and in her nasty old clothes, having nothing left of all her finery but one of her little glass slippers, fellow to the one she had dropped. Being got home, she ran to seek out her godmother and thanked her for a most magical evening, and apologized for her late departure. As she was eagerly telling her godmother what had happened at the ball, the 2 sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "Oh, how long have you stayed?" cried she, gaping and rubbing her eyes, stretching as if she had just been awake from her sleep. "If you had been at the ball," cried one of the sisters, "you would not have been tired with it. There came the finest princess, the most beautiful was ever seen with mortal eyes, and she showed us 1,000 civilities and gave us oranges and other fruit." Cinderella was transported with joy. "But she hurried away immediately when it was struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers. the prettiest in all the world, which the king's son had taken up as it was clear that he was very much in love with this beautiful person who owned the little glass slipper. At which Cinderella could not help but smile with joy. The very next day, the king's son caused it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry her whose foot fit the slipper. They whom he employed began to try it on upon the princesses, the duchesses, and all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who did all they possibly could to thrust their feet into the slipper, but they could not effect it. Cinderella, who saw all this and knew it was her slipper, said to them laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing. "Oh, Cinderella, oh, you're too much." Oh, and they began to banter her. But the gentleman who was sent to try on the slipper had orders to let everyone try it on, so he invited Cinderella to come and sit down, and putting the slipper on her foot, he found it went on very easily, and it fit her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment her two sisters were in was excessively great, but still abundantly greater, when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. Thereupon, in came her godmother, who, having touched with her wand Cinderella's clothes, turned them into the magnificent gown that she had worn to the ball. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady that they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment that they had made her undergo. Cinderella took them up, and as she embraced them, cried that she forgave them with all her heart, and she desired them to always love her. She was conducted to the young prince, dressed as she was, and he found her more charming than ever. So, the poor little Cinder Maid married the prince. They became king and queen, and they lived happily ever after. The end.